Oh, sorry, I should have got ahead in my slides. Yeah, so this has been settled by the Supreme Court of Canada relatively recently. I mean, 2004. Now, it is now illegal to enforce any kind of corporal punishment in schools. So, you can't get the strap, you can't be paddled, anything like that. And that did used to happen when my father was alive and he was still working. He was a principal in North Bay at Sunset and at Marshall Park School. I think he was a principal for 1 year at Tweedsmuir as well. This would have been in the 60s. And I've had people walk up to me and say, "You're Howard Calverley's daughter? Your dad gave me the strap when I was in school." And I'm like, I'm sorry. But this used to be, fairly common. Even now, in the United States, there are some school districts that permit paddling or strapping. They have to have the parents' permission, but it is still permitted in some areas. Now, another kind of child abuse is psychological maltreatment, which most of us just call emotional abuse, whether it's verbal, mental, or psychological maltreatment. Now, you might not realize this, but repeatedly exposing a child to family violence is considered one example of legally recognized emotional abuse, something that can and will harm a child emotionally. So staying in a situation of interpersonal partner violence for the person who is the victim in that situation may lead in extreme cases to them being charged with abuse of an emotional nature against their children. And then, kind of as a catch-all category, your textbook identifies other abuse as well. Other abuse is not a legal approach. In terms of the legalities of it, it would have to be classified into a specific category. So how much of a problem is child abuse in Canada specifically? Well, your text goes into a lot of details about this and throws a lot of statistics at you. I don't want to say stats aren't important because, I don't know, I'd probably lose my job. But what I like about stats is focus on what they're telling us. Focus on what they're telling us and focus on what would be most surprising. That's not really common knowledge. When I look at the statistics in your textbook, and yes, it's an American textbook, the first thing I focus on is that everybody is in agreement that child abuse of all kinds is not just underreported, it is severely underreported. So every official and expert in every area agrees it's severely underreported, and because of that, we can only really guess at the magnitude of the problem in reality. Generally speaking, because of course, statistics change every few years, the two most reported kinds of child abuse are neglect and exposure to intimate partner violence. And that is specifically Canadian. Neglect and intimate partner violence are the two most reported in Canada. Just like sexual assault of an adult might be sexual assault, but it's not determined to be a sexual assault in a court of law because it can be difficult to prove. It's the same with child abuse. And Statistics Canada indicates that children are more at risk for physical and sexual violence than adults are. And they're more likely to be assaulted in a private dwelling, usually their own home. In the US, as stated in your textbook, this is a direct quote, more children under the age of 4 die from abuse and neglect than from falls, choking, drowning, fires, or motor vehicle accidents, end quote. The overwhelming majority of perpetrators are family members, not strangers. So the majority are not luring children to their cars with puppies or candy or snatching them off the street. The majority are family members. And most often, it's the mother who abuses the child. And yes, just as it is possible to identify particular characteristics or circumstances that will make it more likely for a person to be the victim of intimate partner violence if they're an adult, it's also possible to identify certain characteristics or circumstances that make child abuse more likely. We know that parents who are especially stressed for whatever reason are more likely to abuse their children. If they are isolated without much social support from family or friends, they're more likely to abuse their children. We know that if they are a survivor of child abuse themselves, they're more likely to repeat that pattern with their own kids. We know that if they are a single parent, they're more likely to abuse their kids, again because they're doing it all themselves. And we also know that age is a risk factor. Young parents are much more likely to abuse their children. That doesn't surprise me because, you see these kids who are having their own kids, in their late teens or their early 20s. And being a parent is stressful to begin with. To be doing it at that age, when you're not fully cooked yourself and you're not financially established, of course there's going to be more stress. Now, elder abuse is a term referring to any knowing, intentional, or failure to act by a caregiver or somebody else with somebody 60 or older. Elder abuse generally is not as widely recognized in society. It doesn't receive quite as much attention. Although the lack of care in long-term care homes gained a lot of attention during the COVID-19 pandemic. As with child abuse, elder abuse has always existed, and it does have certain similarities with child abuse. Generally, what is considered physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or neglect of a child is very similar to what is considered physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or neglect of a senior. But there are two categories of abuse of a senior that need to be addressed specifically. And this includes financial exploitation as the first one. Financial exploitation can occur in several ways. It might involve a family member or person whom the older adult trusts, like a friend or a caregiver. It can happen when a family member or friend takes over financial decisions and control of the adult's money. Or if a family member, friend, or power of attorney controls the money, but disregards the older adult's financial obligations. Maybe they don't fulfill instructions under the power of attorney. And adult children may not consider or realize that their actions are financially abusive or neglectful towards their parents. Common examples include a family member who repeatedly pressures a parent for money or who borrows money but never repays it. A family member who sells a parent's house or other property and then uses some of the money for their own benefit. Adult children who use a parent's pension and then makes the parent ask them for money. A person who misuses a power of attorney. A person who forces or tricks a senior into signing or changing a contract or will. Some forms of financial abuse involve straightforward theft or fraud, or maybe neglecting to pay a rent or a mortgage or medical insurance or bills. And just as a side note, so there's two different kinds of power of attorney. There's power of attorney for financial reasons, and then there's power of attorney for healthcare decisions. Most people are aware of that. What you might not be aware of is when putting in place a power of attorney for financial reasons, or altering it in any way, when you go in to see a lawyer to have that done, every lawyer by law is required to meet with the person who is handing over power of attorney separately by themselves without anybody else present. So if you take your mom or dad or somebody else takes them to the lawyer's office to sign the paper, at some point the lawyer will ask everybody else to leave the room except for the senior person and ask them, are you being coerced? Are you being pressured? Da 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 da. Years ago, when my father was still alive, they wanted to update their will, whatever. So I brought them to the lawyers, and I wasn't aware of this at the time. This must have been 20 years ago. Fine. I did the driving. I brought them. It was downtown. They knew they'd have trouble getting parking. And so, the lawyer asked me to leave, and I was like, oh, and they're like, we just need to talk to your dad separately and then your mom separately. And I said, oh, sure, no problem. So when I came back in, the lawyer explained why that had been done. They said, I know that they're doing this of their own free will. I'm like, oh, and then because I'm nosy, I said, have you ever had somebody leave the room and then the older person tells you complete opposite? And they said, yes. They had an older woman come in with her son, and they said the second the son left the room, and the lawyer looked at the woman and said, I just want to make sure you're doing this of your own free will. She said, no, I'm not. I want this, this, and this. And it was basically the exact opposite of what her son wanted. And they're not allowed to tell, they don't have to tell people what you're deciding. So I just thought that was really interesting. And I mean, kind of funny because it's not my family. So there are legal things in place to help seniors. At the same time, if a senior, there's a lot of reasons why a senior wouldn't speak up, but I just want you to be aware of that. Now, another kind of elder abuse is abandonment. Just abandonment, desertion, when a person or people are supposed to be responsible for that person. An elderly person who is alone and who appears confused or lost or frightened may be the victim of abandonment. Other signs include neglect, or the elderly person looking frail, or they appear lonely or depressed. Maybe they're dehydrated or malnourished or have poor hygiene. Elderly abandonment may mean the deliberate desertion of a senior, dropping them off at a care facility or the hospital, or just leaving them in a public place. It may mean leaving in their home or apartment for weeks or months on end before the person is discovered. Now, this may occur because the person in charge of providing care feels overwhelmed and they're just unable to cope with the responsibility. They might be resentful to the point where they feel they can't deal with the situation anymore. And yes, in some cases, they are simply uncaring and vindictive. Sometimes abandonment occurs because there's no clear definition about who's responsible for what. So either family members haven't discussed what needs to be looked after clearly and thoroughly and who's doing what. Maybe there's no estate planning or poor estate planning. Financial abuse and neglect are the most prevalent forms of elder abuse in both the United States and Canada. And the thing is, even though they're adults, seniors who are being mistreated in any way may have an extremely difficult time reporting it to authorities and seeking any kind of assistance or trying to change the situation. Sometimes they're physically frail and their mobility is limited for some reason, so they're unable to go anywhere on their own. Sometimes they have mental health issues such as dementia, or have difficulty navigating modern technology, so it's not like they can email somebody or text somebody. And if they report somebody who is a caregiver, is that going to be perceived as a reason to put them in a home? So it's not just a straightforward situation because they're adults. So overall, why does all of this occur at all? And I'm going to wrap up this discussion by looking at theories regarding why I keep wanting to say interpersonal, intimate partner violence occurs. The first theory about this is called the intergenerational transmission of violence, which I've already alluded to. This means that somebody learns to be violent. They learn to be an abuser, or they learn to allow abuse to happen to them without trying to stop it, mainly in their family of origin. You know, our family that we grew up in is where we learn how to behave in every way. What's considered appropriate for us in terms of our behavior, and we learn what is considered appropriate for us in terms of how other people treat us. This is a very, very widely accepted theory. But at the same time, it's not just a straightforward A leads to B scenario, because we know without a doubt that although boys who witness or experience abuse are more likely to be abusers themselves as an adult, at the same time, most who witness abuse when they're children don't become abusers themselves. And I know that may sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not. The majority of people who witness violence in their home do not grow up to be violent themselves, but they're more likely to than those who don't grow up in a violent household. So that's the first theoretical explanation for why somebody might be in an abusive, intimate relationship. And the second is stress theory. Even more simple and straightforward. That stress levels affect a person in a variety of ways. And the more stress a person is subject to, that will increase the likelihood of violence. This is why intimate partner violence is more likely to occur in a low-income household. This is why parents of a chronically ill or developmentally delayed child or family member are at higher risk of intimate partner violence. The constant, never-ending, no light at the end of the tunnel stress, which can be completely debilitating, completely overwhelming. We can also consider larger explanations for intimate partner violence, and by this, I mean aspects of an entire society that might help to explain why it occurs, such as patriarchy, a system of social organization in which only men have access to power. We in the West tend to automatically assume countries that are strongly patriarchal in nature are always less developed countries, but that's not true. The majority are, but for example, Japan is an extremely modern country in every way, except in regards to patriarchy, its attitudes towards a woman's proper place in society. Even in the West, in the US and Canada, although our societies are not overwhelmingly patriarchal in nature, meaning that women have no rights, individual men may still hold these beliefs personally, and they are more likely to be abusive. Another larger societal-wide explanation for the existence of IPV is somewhat tied to patriarchy, cultural norms that sometimes support violence. Violent action movies are very popular. We're Canadian. If we're watching hockey, we tend to get really excited watching a fight break out. So, you know, on one hand, we'd like to think, oh, we live in a very non-violent society, a society that does not support in any way the existence of violence. But on the other hand, the fact is that in a lot of ways, violence is not only accepted, but considered in some ways positive. Another reason that intimate partner violence exists is because of the very, very, very long-standing norm that what occurs in a family's home should stay there, that it's private, it's nobody else's business. I alluded at the very beginning of this lecture that that's the way it used to be perceived prior to the 80s. Don't stick your nose in your neighbor's business. Close the window and then turn the TV up. I'm serious. That's literally how you were supposed to react. Thankfully, most people don't take this attitude anymore, and society as a whole has changed its perception. But at the same time, the root of that belief, the seed of it, still remains. Your private life is supposed to be just that, private. It is assumed this is how everybody thinks. Let people make their own decisions about their own lives and stay out of it. And this is supported by the fact that neighbors just don't know each other the way they used to, which I personally think is in large part because instead of spending every day outside all day playing in the street, kids are just inside. So you don't get to know your neighbors the way you used to. Your text refers to Nicole Brown Simpson as an example of this. O.J. Simpson was charged with her murder, her estranged husband at the time. And I remember very clearly when this murder trial occurred. I was actually completing the third year of my undergrad when the verdict came in. And I remember the publicity it brought to the problem of people not speaking up and getting involved in somebody's business, even when they knew they should in order to help that person. Nicole Brown went so far as to put pictures of herself after being abused in a safety deposit box so that she had evidence of what had occurred. She wrote about it in her diary, but her family and friends had no idea of the extent of it. And the last possible explanation that I want to touch on is power. Simply that, power, an imbalance of power. Power in a relationship may be based on approval, affection, sex, financial resources, social status, time, recognition, and really anything else you can think of. Somebody who is violent is trying to assert their power, their domination, their control, their position as the one with the most power. And as I say that, I realize that, at the most basic level, for every kind of intimate partner violence that exists in every kind of relationship, that's what it all boils down to: power and thus control and dominance. This is why in wartime situations, sexual assault is used specifically as an instrument of power. During the Bosnian conflict, there were actual rape camps set up with bunk beds, so much space you could barely walk between them, because rape was used as an instrument of power over women. This is a really, really involved lecture, a very detailed chapter. There's lots and lots of information in here. I'm almost thinking I should have divided it in two. And instead of moving on to a different chapter for the last lecture, I should have made this one too, but we're not going back now. Just because it's such a complicated issue. Like I said at the very beginning, there is no way for me to speak to you in one lecture about all of the intricacies and the issues and all the details that are involved in intimate partner violence. The best I can do is try to give you an overall accurate, not based in stereotypes, general understanding of what intimate partner violence is, and how it affects families and households. So I hope, with that goal in mind, I hope that I've been able to do that for you.